Welcome to our panel today at State Fiscal Policy, the Road to Prosperity for All. My name's Dan Lesser. I'm the Director of Economic Justice and Illinois State Policy at the Shriver Center. I'll be the moderator today. So state fiscal policy sounds like a pretty dry topic, I think, to most people, and that's kind of unfortunate because it's such an important topic, and you know, who we tax and how we spend really defines us as a society. And if we fail to raise enough revenue, it's a threat to all the programs we care about. The Shriver Center places a lot of importance on this issue, and that's why for the past 8 years, John Bowman, our president, has led a coalition of over 300 Illinois organizations that's united in our advocacy for adequate revenue fairly raised. What we're going to do today with our esteemed panel is talk about some of the economic arguments that underlie the debate about fiscal policy. And we're also going to learn from a couple of states that have tested competing theories of how to get to prosperity. So Kansas, which did massive tax cuts, and Minnesota, which had significant tax increases. And we've got experts from those two states. So our goal today is to educate, but really to go beyond that and to make you a confident, articulate, forceful advocate on these issues. We are just thrilled by the experts we have on our panel, very distinguished today. Because we have a lot of ground to cover in a short period of time, I'm going to give them the briefest of introductions, but if you'd like to learn more about them and their accomplishments, it's all on our conference app. And so let me quickly introduce each one, and then we'll start off with Annie, who's going to lead off. So Annie McKay is the president and CEO of Kansas Action for Children. And Annie's going to talk about, as I said, the Kansas experience. And then next to her is Nan Madden, who's going to go next, and she's the director of the Minnesota Budget Project. She's going to talk about, obviously, the Minnesota experience. Then we have Mike Leachman, and he's the director of Fiscal Policy Research at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities in Washington, D.C. And Mike is going to talk about some of the myths that you hear continually in connection with fiscal policy. And he's also going to identify some states that have had similar experiences to Kansas and Minnesota. And then clean up for us is Ralph Martyria. Many of you know Ralph. He is the executive director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability here in Chicago. And Ralph is going to talk about what does an optimum revenue system look like, and what does Illinois need to do to get there. So with that, they'll each take a few minutes, and then after that, I'll have some questions for the panel, and then we'll open it up for your questions. So Annie, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan. Good morning. What Dan said is true. I will talk about Kansas, and I will also do it without openly weeping. If any of you have been following the Kansas story over the last several years, it has not been one that has felt good to tell. And just to be upfront, I'm a proud native Kansan. I think that my home state is one of the greatest places on the face of the earth, and I recognize that the story I'm about to tell you makes my state and my people look pretty unintelligent and maybe immensely bad at math. So let's just get that out there and establish that up front. So for those of you who only know Kansas as a flyover state or from the Wizard of Oz, it's important to know that we have had a long history of very pragmatic and practical policymaking, investments in our communities, valuing public education and taking care of our neighbors, strong roads, existing in a centrist environment. And the reason why I say that is because what began in 2010 was a vast departure for those of us in the state from what we had long known. And that's the point at which Governor Sam Brownback was elected to his first term. And I think looking back now and where we sit with the federal administration, it looked a lot like the beta testing of Make America Great Again. Governor Brownback took office and said that he wanted to create a red state policy model. He wanted to use Kansas as a laboratory for policy making that reflected what we now know, extremism. And so he set out doing that by teaming up with Art Laffer. And we actually paid Art Laffer using taxpayer resources, sum of $75,000 to set us down this perilous path. That's the part that makes us not look very bright. And so in doing that, we had sort of two steps. And the two steps were, one was tax reform. And tax reform was packaged and passed in 2012. And the second step was what was not being discussed. And I'll talk about those in greater detail. But step one was the unprecedented tax reform, and it looks almost identical to what's being discussed right now in D.C. And a lot of times when I'm watching the conversations that are happening on the Hill, it's just a little traumatic for me as a Kansan because we've lived through all of this. What we did was we collapsed our top two brackets. We had 3 brackets. We collapsed the top 2, and now millionaires were paying the same rate as working Kansas families making $30,000. What we did next was had sort of a gradual reduction with the idea, and Governor Brownback put forward, that he wanted to make Kansas a no-income tax state. He wanted to eliminate, eventually, over half of our state's revenue. That was his goal. And so he put us on the glide path with the idea that eventually the reductions would stair-step down over time. The other piece that they implemented was taking 330,000 businesses off the tax rolls altogether, no longer paying any income tax whatsoever. Now, it may shock you to know that Kansas is not necessarily where a lot of corporate headquarters exist. So the majority of our business arena are these small businesses. And when they did the pass-through exemption, or what we call on the ground in Kansas the loophole, not only did they underestimate it in terms of the number of businesses who were going to be taking advantage of it, but they also completely forgot to include farmers. Now, Kansas is an ag state, and the fact that they overlooked counting farmers in this group was pretty stunning, and also shows the sort of haphazard way in which this was thrown together. I'm going to give you a lot of examples in ways in which we just don't look intelligent, so just stick with me. But, the deal was that Governor Brownback, we were coming out of the recession. Kansas, like a lot of other states, was struggling. And rather than just riding out, investing in the things that we knew worked, which everybody else will talk about to greater degrees, he said he wanted to do something to catapult us ahead, and claimed that this would be, in his infamous words, a shot of adrenaline to the heart of the Kansas economy. That by setting us down this path, people and businesses would be coming by the busloads to Kansas in a modern-day gold rush. And while I think the state is great, it turns out that didn't actually happen. And when they were selling this in 2012, I think it's important to understand that the civic engagement machine was not up and running. And that's an important part of the story later when we talk about the Kansas comeback. But Kansans were not connected to tax policy. They were largely not connected to what was happening at the State House. Our grassroots engagement was certainly lacking at the time. But they were also using dynamic scoring. We now refer to that affectionately as magic math in Kansas. And they had runs that showed growth of 5%. And so even lawmakers who didn't have their heads wrapped around tax policy were seeing runs put before them by our legislative research department with assumptions of just fantasy, right, around what would happen in the coming years. So they also claimed that there would be no impacts to government. They said that there would be no required offsets, no budget cuts. Because this would be the shot of adrenaline, revenue would continue coming in. And so no, they assured us this was not an attempt to shrink the size of government. But step 2 was about reducing the size of government, and it came by way of massive revenue loss. In the first full year of the tax plan, we lost more revenue than the 3 years of the Great Recession combined. The revenue dropped like a rock. And soon we began small budget cuts, mid-year budget cuts. And within 3 years, we had 9 consecutive rounds of budget cuts, not just by the legislature, but allotments by the governor. It ended in 2015 that schools couldn't actually finish out the school year. And a lot of schools around the state closed up shop. Kids didn't finish out the academic year. There was a superintendent in a small South Central Kansas community who gave up her paycheck so that district could make payroll. We were cutting Meals on Wheels, other services for seniors, early education. It was felt beginning to end in terms of Kansans and their lives. Our roads were no longer being repaired. And that was really the beginning of the dumpster fire. We also had more debt coming out of this than we did when we came out of the Great Recession. We were piling up debt as we were bonding left and right for our public pension system. That certainly may sound familiar to folks from Illinois. As we were doing that, we were laundering money. Sorry if that's a sensitive topic. We were essentially laundering money through our Department of Transportation, because while we can't bond for general government, we could for roads. And so the legislature and the governor started bonding for roads and then taking money from what we called the Bank of KDOT, the Bank of Kansas Department of Transportation. So we would bond $400 million, and that would come in, and then we would take $400 million and use it to backfill the state's budget hole, never repairing a road, never moving on to our comprehensive 10-year transportation program. We had a structure in place that allowed us to get around Kansas's highways, repairing them once every 9 years. But as a result of all of these sweeps and cuts, we were now facing repairs once every 50 years. Now, obviously, you can get back to repairing roads, and certainly at a greater expense depending on what supplies cost. But what we weren't going to get back were those chances at the beginning years of children's life or public education, right? Those were some of the things that we were leveraging, and we were balancing the budget on the backs of Kansas kids. So, but maybe you're saying, there are some of you who are saying, but that's the price you pay for job growth, and it can be, sort of resolved when the economic ship is sailing. I hope none of you think that, but if you do, except for that pesky little fact that the jobs never happened. There was no explosive growth. We were sort of middle of the pack before within our region, and now we were falling to back of the pack. We were having negative job growth. When site selectors and local chambers of commerce were working to bring businesses in, all of the negative impacts of divestment from community were shaping the way business were looking at Kansas for opportunity, to the point where local chambers of commerce stepped out of our state chamber of commerce and began speaking out against the tax plan and working to undo its impacts. We had 3 credit downgrades, and while we did not have AAA rating before, we certainly were proud of the rating that we had. And with 3 credit downgrades, it was causing a lot of concern amongst our state about where we were going to go. So there was also a lot of out-migration. I do think Kansas is one of the greatest states in the nation. However, not everybody does, and it turns out this was not a very good advertisement for it. And so we saw people leaving, right? As our public sector shrunk, we saw teachers leaving, we saw other public employees leaving, we saw families leaving the state because it was no longer the greatest place to raise a child. So we were experiencing out-migration at the same time. That being said, I'm going to close with what feels like a really horrendous story, but we're starting to raise the ship from the bottom, so we'll probably get to that maybe in question and answer, but just to sort of put for you all, come one, come all, we're turning it around in Kansas.
Thank you. So thanks for the opportunity to talk to all of you about the Minnesota experience, and also congrats to Shriver Center on celebrating your 50th. It's exciting. So I'm just going to talk a little bit. Minnesota's taken a different path than Kansas. And I just want to talk a little bit about the experience in Minnesota, but also how fiscal policy fits into the bigger picture, right? Because I really see it as part of creating prosperity for everyone in our state. And what that looks like to me, when we've done our fiscal policy work in the right way, it means we're moving towards becoming a state where we invest in our public services that Minnesotans count on to get ahead and to support their families. It's a state where people with disabilities and our elders can live in dignity in their own communities and the settings they choose. We're becoming a state where Minnesotans can get a quality education and land a good job regardless of who they are or what part of the state they live in. And it means we're moving towards becoming a state where people at all income levels pay their fair share, not more, not less, towards funding those public investments. We've taken some strong steps in that direction, and I do think we've learned some things that can be an example for other states. I know sometimes people think Minnesota is some kind of lefty utopia where these things easily happen. This was like a 10-year project to get progressive tax increases across, and we really are a much more purple state than many people realize. Our current governor, Mark Dayton, is actually the first Democratic governor in my adult life. Our previous governor, Tim Pawlenty, was a Republican presidential candidate, if you remember him. And control in the bodies of our legislature tends to flip back and forth between Democratic and Republican majorities. So we are much more purple. We are a lot more like Wisconsin than I think some people realize. Minnesota also, like many other states, went through more than a decade of frequent budget deficits starting in the early 2000s that had seriously eroded our public services and meant that year after year we were having state budget shortfalls. And that experience certainly is part of what led up to being able to pass a progressive revenue package in 2013. But it wasn't necessarily a straight line. It wasn't a slam dunk that we were going to get there. Why it's so important to Minnesota that we did pass that progressive revenue package in 2013? Because when the state raises enough revenue, and we're not all the way there yet, but we made some good steps forward, but when you're raising enough revenue, then other things become possible. Then you can do the investments you want to make in early education, in affordable housing, in healthcare, and other critical issues. It's just really hard to move forward if you don't have the funding base. So I wanted to share what were some of the conversations that were going on, what were some of the themes and narratives that I think were so important in getting that progressive tax package passed, so you can think about how those might play out here. First of all, and you know, there's always good work about what's the best way to message these things, but first of all is what I'm going to call tax fairness. Minnesota has an upside-down tax system, like all other states, where the people who had the most money actually pay the smallest share of their incomes in Minnesota taxes. That is something that Governor Dayton, throughout his first campaign for governor, talked about it all the time. As a tax wonk, it was so exciting to have a gubernatorial candidate basically showing our the state's tax incidence chart, which is something that like we love, but you know, that the public really got a strong understanding of how upside down the tax system was really important. Secondly, that the discussion is always connecting the dots between taxes and what they pay for. We never want to be just talking about taxes in and of themselves, but always connecting the dots. And through this effort, there were a whole lot of very different kinds of voices speaking very clearly and evocatively about what we could do differently in Minnesota if we had more revenues and if those revenues were raised fairly. Third, we had a strong and clear explanation of how the state had gotten into the situation we were in the 2000s of constant budget deficits, right? Because the other side had their clear story, which was excessive, out-of-control spending was the problem. And we saw that that was not the case. So we, many others, our partners, were equipped to tell the story of what were the real and specific policy choices that got us where we were. That we had done irresponsible tax cuts at the end of the 90s and early 2000s. Anyone remember that time right before the tech bubble burst, where there was all this hullabaloo about how we had defeated the business cycle and there was never going to be an economic downturn ever again? So we bought into that big in Minnesota, and we overdid it on tax cutting during that time. And that meant we had larger budget deficits than we needed to really, than we would have had we not done that. We had a governor and some legislative leaders who were really sticking to a no new taxes pledge. That meant we were addressing our budget shortfalls with gimmicks that just kicked the problem down the road, as well as harmful cuts to services. And again, I remember very clearly Governor Pawlenty came out with a budget in 2003 proposing cuts to Meals on Wheels. And I'm like, that doesn't really feel like the live within our means that I think the public thought that they were going to get. We talked about how we were instead paying for our public services in kind of sneaky and unfair ways. So instead of using kind of a broad-based state revenue increase based on ability to pay, instead we had year after year of double-digit tuition increases at our public colleges and universities because we were squeezing local governments. Property taxes were on the rise, a whole kind of increases in fees and fines. And just a little offside, I think we're really feeling some of the implications of that today in Minnesota when we look at the problem of traffic stops and people who now they have to pay this big fine on top of whatever kind of ticket or traffic stop they have, and then people can't pay that, and then their license gets revoked, and then they get pulled over again, and it's this never-ending cycle. Some of that has that roots in this no new taxes pledge of the 2000s. And then we talked about how, because we had made, as a state, we were making these choices not to use broad-based state revenue increases, but all these other kind of sneaky ways. That meant our tax system was becoming less fair over time. And then, of course, part of this public debate was kind of pushing back on this kind of economic theory that lower taxes and lower public service spending brings economic growth. So ultimately, Minnesota did pass a tax package that raised significant new revenue. It made our tax system more fair. Some of the primary pieces of that package were we created a new income tax bracket on the 2% of Minnesotans with the highest incomes. We actually, in that package, reduced property taxes for working class and middle-income people, closed some corporate tax benefits, and raised tobacco taxes. So that's kind of the big pictures of that package. That raised our revenues by more than $1 billion. That's about 6%. Some of that money just went to fill in a budget deficit, but some of that money went to invest in places that really make a difference. We expanded free all-day kindergarten to all school districts. We didn't have that before. We expanded access to quality early childhood education for at-risk kids. We were able to put in a tuition freeze and fund some additional financial aid at our public colleges and universities. We've invested in economic development and workforce development, and started to repair the relationship between the state and local governments. So I think Minnesota's experience shows that having relatively higher taxes and public investment, a relatively more progressive tax system, really can go along with a strong economy. So this is the point where I get to do Minnesota versus Wisconsin. I do love Wisconsin, but you know, there's kind of been this natural experiment going on between Minnesota taking a kind of high road approach of progressive tax policy, public investments, expanding wage and job quality standards, compared to what we see in Wisconsin with kind of a lower taxes and anti-labor approach. And when we compare those two states, Minnesota is stronger than Wisconsin on a whole number of economic measures. Our median household income is nearly $9,000 higher. We have lower unemployment, lower long-term unemployment, higher labor participation rates in Minnesota than in Wisconsin, and we do have a fairer tax system, so we are treating our everyday folks more fairly than in Wisconsin. There is a lot of stuff out there, Minnesota versus Wisconsin. I think it's useful to use that information to highlight that this kind of high road approach can go along with a successful economy. I do want to caution you to not go too far with it. Sometimes I see stuff out in the blogosphere that says like Minnesota is doing better today because of the tax increases and investments we made in 2013. I think it's more related to a longer history of investment, and certainly I do think the investments we've made in education are going to pay off, but clearly the early childhood investments we made like 3 years ago are not contributing vastly to our economy today. So just don't go too crazy with the Minnesota versus Wisconsin thing. But clearly I think what we've done in Minnesota with our tax and public investment strategies are making important steps forward to making Minnesota a place where everybody can thrive. Thank you.
Great. Well, hi, everybody. It's great to be here. So my job is to take down this notion that tax cuts, and especially tax cuts for the very rich and for corporations, are the key to state economic growth. So let me start by just saying that if you believed the claims that tax cut proponents use, that you ought to be able to go back and look at states that tried this approach in the past and see a boom, an economic boom. So we've done that. We went back 30 or 40 years and looked at every state that cut their income taxes significantly and then tracked what happened to their economy afterwards. So Kansas is one of those stories, and he's made clear how that turned out. But it's not just Kansas. We didn't find evidence that those states saw their economies boom in the years after they cut taxes significantly. In fact, we were more likely to find that those states saw slower economic growth than states that were more prudent. Now, there's a lot of factors involved in what happens in state economies, and so it's also important to look at the serious academic literature on this question. So we've done that too. We went back and looked at every peer-reviewed academic journal on the relationship between state economic growth and tax levels, state and local tax levels, and that we could get our hands on. And we found that the heavy majority of those studies found no relationship between lower tax levels and stronger economic growth. So why is that? Well, for one thing, the arguments that underlie, or the assumptions that underlie these claims are wrong and deeply wrong. So one thing, for example, that you often hear is that we need to cut our state taxes so that people and businesses will move here. And when they move here, that'll make our economy bigger, and that'll be good for everybody. So that's wrong about what the literature says about why people and businesses move. Taxes are a minor factor. But it also just gets wrong, it focuses on the wrong part of job growth. The vast majority of job growth in every state in the country is homegrown. The vast majority. That means jobs that are produced by startups, businesses that people start up in the state, or the expansion of businesses that are already in the state. That accounts for the vast, vast majority of job growth in every state in the country. So if you're focused instead on the more narrow slice of the pie, jobs that come into your state from outside, if you're too focused on that slice to the detriment of your ability to grow jobs within your state with your existing people and businesses, it's sort of like trying to hitchhike your way to prosperity instead of driving there yourself. Another notion that you often hear is that we have to cut taxes for small businesses. If we cut their taxes, then small businesses will unleash job growth. So that's wrong on a number of counts. I mean, for one thing, for most businesses, the amount of income tax cut that you can give to a small business is not going to be enough to allow them to hire even a single person, given the profits of most businesses. But aside from those sorts of concerns, it also just gets wrong the role of small businesses in the economy. So most small businesses are not focused on rapid growth. Most small businesses are focused on filling a niche in their community. So the hairdresser, the hardware store. They're really important. They're integral to our neighborhoods, and public policy should pay attention to small businesses as such, right? But if we're talking about how do you get rapid job growth, it's more important to focus on startups and not small businesses writ large. And when I talk about startups, I'm really thinking about a small group of startups that grow very rapidly in their first few years. It's those firms that have a really outsized role in job creation. So how do you, and if you want, and if you ask the successful entrepreneurs that have started these companies, why did you start your company where you did? Why did you found it there? What they'll say, and there's a great survey, for instance, that an industry publication did a couple of years ago that surveyed like hundreds of some of the most successful entrepreneurs in the country. And what they said was, A, it's not taxes. Only 5% of them even mention taxes. Most of these firms, in their first few years, they're not even profitable. So giving them an income tax break is irrelevant. But they also, what they did say is that they founded their companies where they did because that's where they were. And they wouldn't have been able to be successful unless they had a high-quality workforce that helped them make their product and get it to market. And they wouldn't have stayed where they were unless the quality of life wasn't good. They also need access to markets and suppliers. But what that is about is a lot more about public investment than it is about low taxes. So if you want to generate more of those kinds of firms, one thing that you need to do is you just need to think about generating more ideas and good ideas. And how do we do that? So the tax cut approach, tax cuts for the rich, for the very rich, and for corporations, that approach, unstated often, is that there's an assumption that if you give more of our resources to that group of people, which is a narrow group of people, mostly white, mostly men, very rich, right? That's a narrow group of people with a narrow set of experiences. The assumption is that those people are going to come up with the ideas and make the investments that are going to drive the economy. But a much more fruitful approach is to think about investing in all of us, in a broader swath of us. I mean, A, there's more people, you're going to get more ideas. And B, we bring collectively a much richer body of experience. And it's out of our experiences that good ideas come. You know, you think about, it's out of our experiences that you identify problems or opportunities in our lives, things that we recognize need to change or that we see in our communities that need to change. And we use those ideas to, it's out of those ideas that some of the best, most marketable products and services often come. So what the tax cut approach looks like, focused on that narrow group, I mean, really that is about stagnation. It's about corruption. The broader public investment approach that I'm talking about to entrepreneurship, that's what a vibrant economy looks like. That's what democracy looks like. It's what freedom looks like. So, tax cuts haven't worked in the past in states that tried them. The academic literature, by and large, does not support that approach. We need to invest in all of us to build a vibrant economy. Thank you.
Hey, good morning. I am Ralph Martyria, Executive Director of the Bipartisan Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. And yes, my board is bipartisan, not nonpartisan. That means I've got Democrats and Republicans on my board that neither like nor trust each other at all. And that's fantastic for us at the staff because it lets us focus on best practices and data, right? And that's really where you need to go. And before I launch into where we need to go, I need to say something about the Shriver Center. For 50 years, they've been a leading voice in this state for social and economic justice, and we should all thank them for the work they've done to make Illinois a better place. Hey, really, your group is fantastic, Dan. Now, tax policy. Who woke up this morning and said, I want to talk about tax policy? More hands, please. You all should. And I'm going to tell you why. There's a couple of fiscal policy truisms that make tax policy the number one thing you ought to care about, no matter what else you care about, workforce, child care, blah, blah, blah. Number one, if you have inadequate resources on the front end, you will get inadequate outcomes on the back end. Tell me that's not true. In the public sector, when you have inadequate resources on the front end and you get inadequate outcomes on the back end, do they say it's because of a lack of capacity? Is that what politicians say? No. They say you don't know how to run your program. They say your program is underperforming. They never ask the capacity issue because the capacity issue forces them to deal with tax policy. And tax is one of 2 3-letter words ending in X in the English language that really gets people excited. So politicians try to avoid it. They try to avoid it. So they'll blame the program. And when they blame the program, that leads to unjustifiable cuts and political coverage for the powers that be, both parties. So inadequate capacity on the front end, inadequate outcomes on the back end. You should care about tax policy. Second reason, where your needs are greatest, your resources are least. So, if you're not raising revenue the right way, and I'm going to make an argument that the right way is imposing a greater tax burden at the top than the bottom and middle. But if you're not raising revenue the right way and then distributing it to communities of need, you will never meet need. Never meet need. So pay attention to tax policy. So how do you design a good tax system? There are 3 real economic principles in a tax policy course you'd look at. I teach a master's course on this. I'm going to break my master's course down to 7 minutes. Your tax system ought to be fair to taxpayers, responsive to the economy, and stable during poor economic cycles. Those are the 3 things you're looking for your tax system to do. Illinois, 0 for 3. Not surprisingly, that doesn't work. That creates something we call a structural deficit. Fancy words. Easy to understand. It just means, look, if you start a fiscal year with a balanced budget, something Illinois hasn't done since at least 1980, and I go back to 1980 because that's the last year there's data, but we haven't balanced a budget since 1980. But assuming we had one that was balanced, so our revenues and our expenditures were equal, if you just adjust for inflation, historic rates, population growth, normal economic growth going forward, your revenues won't keep up with the cost of maintaining the same level of services from one year to the next. So even without adding or expanding one service or program, you get a little bit of a deficit. And if you don't deal with this structural imbalance, that deficit grows over time and it accumulates to a really big level. So I'm going to give you some numbers. It has accumulated to such a level here in Illinois. Our general fund budget for fiscal year 2018 did pass in a law. They're going to spend about $36 billion. $9 billion of that, hard costs. It's things like debt service that we owe to third parties like banks and bondholders. It's the mandatory pension payment. It's some Medicaid trust fund transfers. It's not going into the kinds of things that they vote on, right? About 27 billion is going to core services. What are those core services? Tell you. 9 out of $10 are 4 things: education, healthcare, social services, and public safety. Y'all care about any of that stuff? And by the way, if you're not from Illinois, I will tell you what your state general fund goes to. 9 out of $10 in your state general fund go to education, healthcare, social services, and public safety. That is every general fund in the states, all 50 states. So we're spending about $27 billion on those this year. Unfortunately, we have an accumulated deficit built up from this structural imbalance over years of well over $15.7 billion. Meaning well over half of the expenditures Illinois is making today on current services, deficit spending. Well over half. Now, many of you may not like math, but I tell you this, even if you're math challenged, running a 53% accumulated deficit is not a sustainable way to go about financing your public sector. So what do we need to do? We need to adjust our tax policy. So I told you we have these 3 principles of tax policy, and the first one is fairness. You measure fairness for taxpayers in two different ways. One's not controversial at all. It's called horizontal tax fairness. You want taxpayers that are similarly situated from an income standpoint to have similar tax burdens, paying about the same amount of money, right? Common sense, rational. The one that gets everybody all heated is vertical tax fairness. How are you fair from a tax policy standpoint to people with very different abilities to pay very different levels of income? And here the textbooks are clear too, and I'm going to actually go back all the way to 1776. There was an important book published that year. It was called The Wealth of Nations. Anybody ever heard of that book, written by Adam Smith? Sort of the cornerstone of capitalism, right? So now I'm going to assume a relatively progressive audience and turn you into a bunch of meat-eating capitalists. Adam Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, said if you're going to have a capitalist economy, your taxes ought to be designed to remedy, this is a quote, to remedy inequality of riches as much as possible by relieving the poor and burdening the rich. That's not Karl Marx, that's Adam flippin' Smith. Now, why did he say that? And the answer was simple. He said, if you have a capitalist economy, guess what? We have a capitalist economy here in Illinois, in the U.S. Economic growth will always disproportionately advantage the people at the top of the income ladder over everybody else. So since they're going to get a disproportionate benefit at the top, they should pay the largest burden out of their income and taxes to support the government and economy that gives them this disproportionate economic benefit. Was Adam right? Just looking at from 1980 to 2016, on an inflation-adjusted basis, we've looked at BEA data, over 100% of all growth in income has gone to the top 10% in America, about 106%. So once again, for the math challenged, 100% would be all of it. So if more than all of the growth in income in America went to the wealthiest 10%, guess what? The bottom 90% are earning less today than they did in 1980. So Adam Smith had a pretty good handle on how things would go. Actually, this distribution is very different than it was from the end of World War II through 1980. Then all income classes were growing over time, but really, since 1980 forward, not been the case. So if you want a fair tax system, you need to focus your burden at the top here, where people are paying it out of their rapidly growing incomes. You don't really want to focus your taxes at the bottom and middle, where now, or at least since 1980, after inflation, people would be paying it out of their growing poverty. Now, the classic way to have this fairness aspect built into your tax system is to have a graduated rate structure for your income tax, right? Where lower rates apply to lower levels of income and higher tax rates apply to higher levels of income. That's a graduated system. Illinois is constitutionally prohibited from doing that. Prohibited. So one thing we need to work for in this state is amending that Constitution so we could just do rational, fair tax policy in Illinois and have this nice graduated rate structure in our income tax. There's a couple other things we need to do. I mentioned stability. Stability is really important at the public sector for one key reason, right? When there's a recession and the public sector is losing revenue, what's happening to demand for public services? It's going up. You know, the private sector never faces that situation. In the private sector, every time demand's growing, the revenue's growing along with it, and then they could hire more capacity and meet the demand. So you really have to focus on financing your public sector the right way using sound principles of public finance. And here, the stable revenue source Illinois is missing the ball on is its sales tax. 45 states in America have a sales tax. We have the most narrow base, meaning our sales tax applies to less of our state's economy than any other state sales tax. And the reason for that is our sales tax pretty much only applies to the sale of goods, hard physical things you could touch, right? This tabletop, my tie, et cetera. We don't tax services. That's goofy because currently in Illinois, just about 17% of our economic activity is the sale of goods, what we do tax, and well over 72% is the sale of services. You just can't leave the largest and fastest growing segment of your economy out of your tax base and expect to have stable revenue over time. But here's the kicker. It's very stable revenue if you tax the services consumers actually buy in the consumer economy, and here's why. During the Great Recession, consumer spending declined. Do you know by how much? 0.6%. Do you know how much of the economy consumer spending is? 68 to 70% of all economic activity. So if our state were to broadly tax what consumers actually purchase in the consumer economy, we would have a stable revenue source even during down cycles. We don't. And even neighboring states like Iowa and Wisconsin, by the way, tax all the services we think you should tax. And so what are we talking about? Haircuts, lawn care, auto repair, that kind of things. Have you seen busloads of people from Iowa, Wisconsin coming into Illinois to get their haircut to avoid that tax? No? Have you seen their haircuts? They should come, shouldn't they? Silly looking people. But they aren't doing it for tax reasons. So the bottom line is we need to get our tax policy in order in this state. We need to deal with eliminating this deficits intelligently and strategically over time, or we'll never be able to invest in the core services that make for a high quality of life and create access to opportunity for vulnerable populations.
All right, did I promise you a great panel today? Did we get one? I'm going to make a public service announcement at this point, which is Ralph was talking about the fair tax. The Responsible Budget Coalition, which John Bowman, our president, leads, is leading the fight for fair tax in Illinois, amending the Illinois Constitution to eliminate the flat tax requirement. So see me afterwards if you want to learn more about the Responsible Budget Coalition and our work on the fair tax. And with that, I have some general questions for the panel, but Annie, I want to ask you a question, which is, so in Kansas, you had this turnaround politically where the Republican General Assembly overrode the governor's veto.
Yes, we did.
Rejected his tax cuts. Do you feel like the hearts and minds of people in Kansas have changed on this as a result of what's happened?
You know, I don't, it's a great question. I don't think they changed so much as they realized what was going on. I mentioned that Kansans had become disconnected from what was happening in the State House, certainly didn't have their arms wrapped around tax policy, sort of gave that power up. And as, you know, this was a years-long effort to kind of turn the ship around, but it included advocacy out across the state, speaking in communities, at invitation by Rotary clubs and school districts and, you know, all sorts of organizations throughout our state and talking to them about what happened and what was coming. And we did that repeatedly. And, you know, the first pass was talking about tax policy and why it mattered and creating that understanding. And then as budget cuts happened, when we went back around, it was oh, that's what you said. And this is what you meant by tax policy. To the point that if you go anywhere in Kansas, now everyday Kansans understand tax policy. They understand its importance to the vibrance of their communities. They understand why they need to pay attention and lift up their voices. So I don't think it was so much about changing hearts and minds as it was about connecting hearts and minds back to the State House. And as a result of that, you know, I mentioned the tax cuts, but we also were increasing fees. We raised the sales tax twice. None of that was able to sort of right the ship. And then in 2016, every extremist incumbent who backed the governor's agenda and had a challenger in either the primary or the general election was sent packing. And we sent a wave of moderates and Democrats. Moderates are a real thing in Kansas. We sent a wave of moderates and Democrats to the State House, nearly a third newly elected, to join with those veteran lawmakers who had survived the earlier fires to then pass tax reform and override the governor's veto, with the Speaker of the House, who had once been, and maybe still is, a darling of Americans for Prosperity and Koch Industries, voting to override that veto. Because the message from Kansans and from the public was clear. This was not the path for our state, and they wanted something different.
I think all of our speakers today have done an excellent job of kind of humanizing the tax issue. It's not a bunch of numbers, which most people think and you don't win with just the numbers. So I think all of you have done a really great job on that. Okay, I'm going to throw this question out to the group. So the other side says cut taxes, create jobs, right? And what's that?
Can I take that? Because we have a special love for that argument.
Yeah, let me finish though. So So the other side says cut taxes, create jobs. And, you know, we can say raise taxes, improve services, but it doesn't quite have the same ring to it or the same appeal. And so the question is really, what advice does everyone have on how to message and how to do it effectively and concisely?
All right, well, I'm the wrong guy for concise. Let's just say that. But here's the thing, cut taxes, create jobs. Let's start with a real simple proposition. Cutting tax on businesses frees up their income to create a job. Sounds rational, right? It's completely irrational. Businesses only hire new people when they need additional capacity to meet growing demand, period. If you cut their taxes at a moment in time when they don't have growing demand, they aren't going to hire people and have wasted excess capacity in-house. That is not how you run a business. They are going to profit take. They'll say, thank you very much, and they'll take your profit. Period, end of story. And I know that not only from the research, and the research is compelling here, but I happen to have been an evil corporate lawyer for about 15 years, representing Fortune 5 companies and banks. This is what they do. Trust me. Number two, when you cut spending on services to pay for a tax cut, the net impact on your economy is job loss. We will be releasing a paper on this, an updated paper on this in January, because no one's going to pay attention to it if we released it now. It's been peer reviewed. But why is that the case? Here's why. What do you spend your money on at the state level? Education, health, social services, and public safety. That's 9 out of $10. But really what you're spending on is the wages of the teachers and the social workers and the healthcare providers and the correctional officers who are online providing these services. These are middle-income families. So when you cut spending to pay for a tax break, you are cutting the income of middle-income families. That's problematic when you look at income data over time, because middle-income families don't do this crazy thing called save. They spend. They spend their incomes because their incomes after inflation have been declining over time. So when you cut spending on services, you're taking money out of your private sector economy as these folks lose their income. Meanwhile, your tax relief is going all over the place. In Illinois, we just had a rollback of a temporary tax increase a few years ago, right? Over half of that tax relief went to the wealthiest 10% in our state. Those aren't good spenders. They are horrible spenders. Their marginal propensity to consume, that is, the likelihood that they're going to take this tax relief and spend it in the economy to create jobs is very small. Why? Because their incomes are growing great after inflation. They're already spending everything they want. So literally, half of our tax relief went into the pockets of people who aren't going to spend it, and we took the money out of people who are going to spend it to pay for it. That, from an economic standpoint, is a loser game, and as it multiplies through our economy, will create job loss. So we need to make this point very clearly and very strongly. And in fact, at the state level, Dan, there's only been 2 things that have had a statistically meaningful correlation to enhancing your state's economic competitiveness that are policy decisions over the last 30 years. How well you invest in your infrastructure and how well you invest in your education. Your tax policy has no such meaningful statistical correlation. Get your tax policy right, make your appropriate investments, fund your core services, your economy will be fine.
A couple thoughts come to mind. One is it's about kind of connecting it to that broader vision of what you want to have for your state, whether that's talking about broad prosperity or opportunity for all. I think that's part of it. Another is thinking about messengers. So we did a project where we partnered with small business owners, the real small businesses, the ones that Mike was talking about, and the message that they sent was, tax cuts are not our priority. There was kind of a sub-message of, and those tax cuts don't actually help us, but they talked about how there were things that they wanted to do in their business that really depended on public investment. So there was an entrepreneur who talked about how our lack of investments in our transportation infrastructure was increasing the cost of his business, and the importance of rolling out high-speed broadband across the state as a way to support small business owners everywhere in our state, not just in the Twin Cities. There was some folks who run a restaurant who talked about how hard it was for them as small employers to compete with large employers in terms of benefits. So when the state invests in affordable childcare or broader wage and benefit standards, how that kind of levels the playing field for them and helps them to do right by their employees. So I think, you know, when you can tell these stories that kind of unpack this kind of just broad message about these tax cuts are good for business and get people thinking about really how businesses work and particularly how small businesses work, I think that can be part of kind of chipping away at this kind of monolith. And I think also just to underline something that Annie said, the difference between kind of local businesses and local chambers of commerce as opposed to the statewide chamber of commerce. You know, those folks are sometimes have different perspectives and can say different things.
You want me to add? I do. You have good stuff. Well, I don't know. Those are great answers. I guess just I would draw, and I tried to do some of this in my talk. But I would draw particular attention to making the choice clear to people. You know, when we're talking about cutting taxes, we're talking about giving money to certain people, right? And especially in the state budget environment, you're going to have to pay for that. So how you're going to pay for that is going to take money, resources from other people. So making that connection really clear is really important. And then, you know, usually what you're talking about is taking money from people who are really important to the economy. And I think this story is one that we need to do a better job of telling, the role that we all play in the economy and the way in which giving more resources to those at the very top at a time when inequality is already really high is hurting us. It's hurting us. It is, as I said, that's the approach of stagnation and corruption. It is not the approach of a vibrant economy, of democracy, of freedom. We have to tell that story because it's true, and it's really, really important right now because we're heading in the wrong direction.
I think those answers are really helpful. I think there's too much of a tendency of the people on I guess our side of the debate to kind of concede the business argument, right? And it's so critical to, and I think you guys have pointed out some great ways to refute that. All right, I'm going to ask one more question, then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. And maybe Mike can start on this one, or someone else. So we're talking about state tax policy today, but there is this elephant in the room, which is federal tax policy, which is moving very quickly through Congress and possibly the Senate today. And so what effect is that going to have on state, assuming that we get some hybrid version of the House and Senate, which aren't all that different, how's that going to affect state economies?
All right. So a couple of things here. 62% of the benefits of the current Senate bill go to the top 1%. Regardless of the rhetoric, this is more the same. And this is why I think the urgency is really important. Another thing to keep in mind is this is only the first step in a two-step process. And Paul Ryan and President Trump and other congressional leaders have been very clear about this. The next step is cutting funding for programs that especially low-income people depend upon, Medicaid, food stamps, TANF. That's next. And this tax bill just makes it more likely that those cuts will be even deeper. It's not paid for. I mean, even the congressional leaders who are pushing this set it up so that it could lose $1.5 trillion over the next 10 years. If you take into account of some of the gimmicks in there and such, it's more expensive than that. And they were already, in the budget resolutions that they passed earlier this year, they were already saying, even with our existing deficits, they were already using our existing deficits as an excuse for very deep cuts in funding for services that we depend on, that states and local governments depend on. 31% of revenue, of state revenues, come from the federal government. So big cuts at the federal level matter for states' ability to do the things that we know we need to do. So it's very worrisome, and watch out for that two-step.
Can I add something to
Sorry,
that?
sure.
I don't know if this is helpful or it's just my pet peeve. So I've been working on tax issues for something like 20 years. I know it can be difficult for groups who don't feel like tax policy is part of their mission. Sometimes it's hard to get engaged on tax policies. The way they've done it this year, compared to some other things I've seen, is a gift, because usually we have to make the argument that sometime, if we do these tax cuts now, sometime in the future, there's going to be cuts to some kind of programs. But they've totally laid out the roadmap. They've already voted in their budget resolution to cut Medicaid, to cut a whole range of safety net services. So I guess I'm just imploring you that if you're dealing with some issues in your organization where people are like, well, I'm not sure we can really connect this tax issue to our mission, it's never been easier to connect the dots because they've already voted and they've already signaled they're willing to cut in Medicaid, in SNAP. You know, it's never been less hypothetical about who's going to get hurt and which areas of the budget are going to get hurt. So I don't know, I kind of wish people would get out their cell phones right now and make a call if they haven't already, but not now, but you know, it is really important to engage on this one.
Just to give some sense to people from Illinois in the room, the 20% cut to SNAP benefits, which is in the budget resolution, would be a loss of $600 million. That's one program out of, you know, Medicaid would be even more. So it just, the dimension of this is astounding.
I'm not sure if we planned an open bar immediately after this, sort of help us cope through some of this. But I do think, to the point about it connecting to, and Nan's, it never being easier, I think about part of the challenge that we faced and then eventual success was making taxes relevant to all of our advocacy organization colleagues in the state, and getting them to, you know, all of us use and sing from the same hymnal. And at the end, that's ultimately what got us there, was when we were all talking about taxes matter because, and everyone in our state was using that message. And the strength of that was phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal.
And you could even get voters to figure that out, but it takes a second. So we did a poll a few years ago, and back in the good old days of a $5 billion deficit in Illinois. And we said the state's got a $5 billion deficit. Question one, should decision makers handle that by cutting spending or raising taxes? What do you think most people said? Cut spending, government waste, fraud, abuse, you know, all that's government stuff. That's what about 68% of the state said cut spending. A few were undecided, and there's about 25% of the liberals on the lakefront. They said you could tax my dreams too as long as it's for the poor children. All right. For all of those people who said cut spending, the next question was a simple one. Here's how the state spends its money. Cut $5 billion, or change your answer to say raise taxes. We went from 68% of the state saying cut spending to 74% of the state saying raise taxes. People don't make the connection between the taxes they're paying and the services provided at the state level. They don't get that 9 out of $10 are education, health, social services, and public safety. We need to make that connection and case for them, because when we do, I think you've seen, people will rally around it. But it's so easy. You know, people are busy, their jobs are horrible, their bosses are ogres, and they live in Illinois, and so, you know, everyone's getting indicted or thrown in jail or whatever. So they think everything is wasteful, whatever. You got to break through that. And the only way to break through that is really intentionally and continually until the message, you know, sinks in. That's number one. And number two, I really think it's important to frame the message in a manner that bridges rather than reinforces ideological divides. We can't, if we means progressives, we can't outshout the organizations funded by the Koch brothers, et cetera. We're not going to outshout them. They're really good at that. What we have to do is find a way to message that reaches across these ideological spasms and gets some moderate to moderately conservative individuals to join us. Because the most important math you could do is getting to 50% of the votes in the legislature plus one. And that's where we have to go. And if you look at Illinois, and you look even at our Democratic reps from downstate and our Democratic senators, a lot of conservatism. So we just have to find a way to message that really reaches across these ideological divides and focuses on the positive economic impacts, what this will mean for communities, that it'll actually enhance job growth, not hurt job. All those messages are really, really crucial to us being successful at the end of the day.
Okay, we're going to open it up for questions now from the audience. This mic.
Thank you.
So I guess this is to Ralph, but perhaps Kansas as well. Just in terms of messaging, what I've, local publications, a sense of hopelessness that the accrued deficit in Illinois is so huge that even if we were to adopt reasonable policies tomorrow, that the hole is so deep. And I don't know what the facts are, and I haven't seen anybody try and sell that issue.
Okay, so the hole is really significant. It's well over 15.7 billion. It might be north of 16 billion at this point. You don't pay it all off in 1 year. And we don't even need to raise that amount in taxes or really anything near that to solve the problem. We've modeled out our structural imbalance problems going forward. Roughly $3 billion in new revenue will over time solve our problem if it's coupled with fixing our pension funding problem. And I know that's not the focus of today's discussion, so I'm just going to be real clear on what the pension funding problem is. It's a goofy statute passed in 1995 that was never intended to be funded. It literally backloaded the repayment of what was borrowed from our pension systems to now. And those repayments are ramping up at annual amounts we could never afford. By, $700, $800 million incremental jumps from year to year to year. It's silly. We have to refinance that, level it out. If we could refinance that in a way that saves us $68 billion over the next 30 years and still gets the pension systems healthy, but for $68 billion less than what the current plan calls for. So that's a big savings. And then raise the $3 billion in revenue, some combination of income and sales taxes. And $3 billion was a big number when I was a kid in the Paleozoic era, but it's really not a big number in context of the Illinois economy. We have a $777 billion state economy. It's less than half of 1% of our economic activity. A net tax increase that takes less than half of 1% of your economic activity is too small to be measured by any peer-reviewed econometric model that looks at these things. So we're talking about a tax increase that's too small to be measured, that's standing in the way of solving our problems. So we really have to reframe and get that message out there rather than talking about, oh my gosh, the bigness of the tax increase. Wait a minute, in context, it's very small, and look at the problems it solves. So it's very solvable.
We've been modeling some scenarios in connection with the fair tax work, and we think we can raise $2 to $3 billion and still provide a tax cut to 80 to 90% of the people in the state. So just eliminating that flat tax requirement in the Constitution, we think can yield a substantial amount of revenue, and we'd be taxing the right people. Other questions?
The Chicago Tribune keeps charging that people are leaving Illinois because of high taxes. and how do you respond to them?
Winston Churchill once said there's three kinds of lies. There are lies, there are goddamn lies, and there are statistics. The statistics that show people running out of the state of Illinois are very interesting, but they are really misused. So let me talk about that. And there was a really great peer-reviewed study done in 2016. My organization co-funded with the Taxpayers Federation, a relatively conservative pro-business tax policy group, by the way. The two researchers were former members of the Illinois Department of Revenue. One had worked under 3 different Republican administrations and one under 2 Democratic, okay? What they found is over the last, and I forget what the period is, if it was 96 years or 95 years, but over that period of time, Illinois has had net out-migration every single year except one. During most of that time, Illinois ranked in the bottom 10 in the nation in total state and local tax burden as a percentage of income when you include all taxes and all fees compared to every other state. So right off the top, it's kind of hard to make the argument that people are running screaming out of the state because of taxes. Now, we did do a temporary tax increase in 2011, and they looked at that. For the 2011, 2012, and 2013 sequence, the first 3 years of the temporary tax increase, out-migration slowed down. Apparently, people couldn't wait to be taxed more, so less of them left. I'm just saying that's what the data show. One more thing, though, that I thought was really compelling in this study. Every single year, more people, just in raw numbers, move out of the state of Illinois into neighboring states, Indiana and Wisconsin, than vice versa. However, as a percentage of state population, a greater percentage of the populations of the states of Wisconsin and Indiana move into Illinois every year than a percentage of our state moves into their states. We're just a big state with a lot of people. And where the people from Wisconsin and Indiana are moving are Cook and the Collar counties where the taxes are highest. When you dig through these arguments on migration associated with tax policy, you see that they are bogus. And they really aren't something that you could hang your hat on. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities actually did a wonderful meta-analysis of this stuff a few years back that looked at all the research on out-migration. And I think the factors that really drove people to move, number 1 is where your job was, number 2 was housing prices, number 3 was the weather, number 4 was relatives. And tax policy barely played at the margins. Literally, it was a margin of error.
Yeah, I agree with all of that and some good resources. Another interesting piece, the ITEP, the Institute for Taxation and Economic Policy, put out a paper recently that compared the states with high income, like the highest high income tax rates or something like that, to other states. And what I really found compelling in that paper too is they also made the argument of when you look at the states that are often held up, Texas and others, they really have some good arguments about how just population growth isn't the same as a growing economy. And those were some new arguments I hadn't heard before, because that's what we hear all the time, Texas growing out of control. Well, Texas having big population increases hasn't really turned out to bring higher living standards for people who live in Texas. So I thought that was a good argument. I also just want to maybe just clarify what I said before, if it sounded like I was nagging on you all about this federal tax debate and getting involved in that. Maybe I was just feeling a little, when I think about what that federal tax bill is going to do to our states, kind of makes me a little crazy. So, the point I was trying to make is it's never been easier to be specific about the harm that would happen to the people you care about and the programs you care about. So that's all, in case it sounded like I was saying, well, aren't you guys doing anything? That's not what I meant.
I want to respond to something Annie asked about the open bar. We will have an open bar at the end of the day.
That's great. I do tax policy for a living. I drink. So
Let me just announce, we're going to have Christina Jimenez from United We Dream is going to speak at the reception at the end of the day, so we're thrilled to have her. She's an extremely inspiring speaker, and then after that, there'll be open bar. So I'm going to let our panelists we're running out of time. I'm going to let them each if you've got something you wanted to say that we didn't get to, or you got a parting shot or some words of inspiration or anything along those lines. Before I hand over the mic, though, let me make sure that everyone's downloaded the app. It's a beautiful app for this conference, and if you download it, you'll be able to rate all of the sessions, including this one. Give us 5 stars, please. And you can share the conversation. We've got a hashtag Shriver50, if you want to bring social media to this. So let me just pass the mic that way.
So I'm going to try to be brief. Add tax policy advocacy to whatever else you do. Make it a priority. Go back to what I said. If we don't have the capacity on the front end, we are not going to get the outcomes on the back end we want. And what we're all fighting for is social and economic justice through adequately financed public sector programs that create access to opportunity. You need to add tax policy to your advocacy program, number 1. If you haven't joined the Responsible Budget Coalition, join it. Number 2, it is fighting for that kind of responsible tax policy. You need to join it.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I'll second that it is these sorts of big picture fiscal questions really underlie our ability to make the investments we need to make. I'll also just say that when we talk with each other about how you really get to a better country, we hear each other, and we can do this. There's a lot of momentum in the country. This is a really important moment. The urgency of getting this playing defense and turning to offense it's right now and super compelling, and we can do it. Thanks.
I think I just would add, certainly every state is different, but we really can learn from each other. The idea of states being kind of laboratories for policy experiments, really resonates to me. So, learn from each other, adapt it for what really works for your state. The center is a great resource on trying to, compile what is the experience when you look across all states. But I think our states also have, examples that you can point to, because certainly the other side is going to point to states that they think have been successful based on a model. And coming from a state that I think has taken another direction and has been successful, we hope that you can pull from our experience to make things better for the people of Illinois.
The only thing that I would add on to the end is that progressive policy can and must happen in every state. We cannot leave progressive tax policy to places where it would be assumed to happen and overlook states like mine. If we do that, we will not create the best outcomes for our country. Now, while we may not call it progressive tax policy in Kansas, make no mistake, language matters, and we found ways to talk about the importance of stability, of revenue, of investments that led to our governor's own party bucking him and overriding him, and not because they, sort of found progressive tax Jesus, but because the way in which we went about doing it connected to them. And we must be committed to doing that in every state in our country. That is how we will be successful in coming out of what we see at the federal level. And Kansas, having lived through this, we also offer support groups.